Hey guys, welcome back to another episode on the Power Wagon mud truck. We're using the Burley mud truck conversion kit from RC Bros and turning this thing into a big powerful mud truck. Now, since I am going to throw big brushless power at this thing in the end, we definitely need to beef up the transmission. And to do that, I picked up a number of parts to get this thing built up to where I would like it. Now, I did pick up a red Vanquish transmission case to match some of the other parts we've used on this build. I also picked up a Holmes Hobbies Torque Master transmission output set. With the other parts, I've also picked up some Robinson Racing steel gears, as well as an Axial Racing 56 to 32 pitch spur gear. Now, this is normally a Yeti option part, but I'm going to make it work for this thing using some of the transmission slipper parts from the existing transmission that came inside of this Axial Power Wagon. Now, transmission builds aren't overly complicated, but I wanted to assemble this little group of parts here that I decided to use and throw them in there. Something to mention is that I am using the Robinson Racing gears. Now, these gears, I'm only using two. I'm using their idler gear, which is steel, and their final gear, which is steel. Normally, I would use a full machined steel gear set. Normally, I like to use the Axial or Hot Racing gear set. Hot Racing isn't something I always use, but their steel transmission gear sets I've actually had really good luck with. The Axial gear set is a fantastic steel all-machine set as well. Now, I mention that because I am going to reuse that top gear in this transmission, which is a sintered steel gear. It is metal, but it's sintered, which is a different process which is used to build that gear. So that's not something I always do because that is weaker than a machined gear. The reason I did that was simply because the things that I was looking for were not in stock almost anywhere that I was looking. So I took a shortcut, and I'm going to do that this way. Just something to know, if later on down the road I blow up that top gear, you guys can tell me I told you so because I'm telling myself I told you so. But for now, I want to get this thing going. I'm just too excited to work on this project to wait for more parts. So we're going to tear into it, and we're going to get that stock transmission out. We're going to build it all up and then put it back in the car. So let's first remove that outer spur gear cover by removing those 3 screws holding it on there. We're not going to reuse that, so we can set that aside. Now let's remove that Axial 27 turn stock motor. This I'm also not going to put back in the truck for now. We're going to replace the motor later. Remove the nut and spring holding the spur assembly on. We are going to reuse those slipper discs as well as that spur gear spacer. Next, remove both drive shafts from the transmission outputs. We are going to reuse these metal slipper discs. Set those aside. Now, I did order that new steel spur gear from Axial, however, I did not order replacement pads. We're actually going to pry off these stock pads from the stock spur gear. Just do this carefully with a razor blade knife, making sure that the adhesive comes off cleanly. Then reapply those pads onto the new spur gear. You can buy these pads brand new, I just didn't. And since this truck hadn't been run much, I didn't see any issue with doing it this method. Here you can see a comparison of thickness between that new steel spur gear and the stock plastic. Remove all the screws holding the 2 halves of the transmission together and then separate those. We are going to need that plastic cap from the back side of the top shaft, so remove that. Now I'm going to remove that idler shaft. We are going to use that with our new gears. Here you can see that Holmes Torque Master spool. I'm placing it inside of that brand new Robinson Racing steel final gear. I'm putting the second half of that Holmes Hobbies Torque Master spool on and then tightening it all up. It comes with 2 shims that I'm going to install as well. This is just to help make the bearings be correctly spaced the distance from each other. Now, I am using the brand new Vanquish red transmission housing for the SCX 10. I'm mocking up all my gears in there, replacing all the bearings with Fast Eddie's bearings, and then using that stock idler shaft that you saw that I removed from the stock transmission housing. Now, like I said before, I am basically reusing the stock upper gear. That is a sintered gear, not a machine gear, but we're going to see how that goes for us. Now, I'm using a micro diamond glide grease for this. It's basically a marine grease. It's used for saltwater fishing reels. Putting a nice light coat onto all of the gears individually and then reinstalling them into the transmission case before reassembling the 2 halves of that transmission case together. Now, here I've got a super shafty ultimate motor plate. This one's actually destined for a Wraith, which does have slightly different spacing for the 4th screw that these motor plates usually use. Now, the nice thing with these is that the bolts go in from the front side on this, and then the nut goes onto the back, rather than how the stock one does with the nuts going in from the rear and then threading into the motor plate itself. You can get a much better hold on that motor plate with this style motor mount. So, a very nice little upgrade. Reinstall that stock spur gear spacer and spur gear disc. The new spur gear comes with a bearing that you use as a spacer to hold it centered. Reinstall all the pieces just like you had uninstalled them from the stock. Tighten that that slipper down almost all the way and then back it off a quarter of turn. Now I reinstalled that plastic cap, and from there we're pretty much finished up. So with that transmission buttoned up, we're one step closer to having this drivetrain where we need it. Now again, just to recap, we used the Vanquish Products transmission case, we used Robinson Racing steel final and idler gears, but we used the stock sintered top gear, which is the one thing that makes me a little nervous about where we're at right now, but for now I think it will be alright. The Holmes Hobbies Torque Master 5mm output is what we use to connect that final gear to the drive shafts. That one piece output is nice because it equalizes any forces that differ between the front and rear axle before transferring the force to the screws that attach it to the final gear. That differs from what most outputs do. Just something to note with that particular setup. We filled the entire transmission with brand new fast eddy bearings, and we used the stock top shaft and used a brand new Axial 32 pitch 56 tooth spur gear that is normally used in the Yeti. Now, I did swap on a super shafty ultimate motor plate that was actually destined for a Wraith transmission. So we didn't get to use all 4 mounting points that that transmission motor plate is normally designed for. We just used 3 and then used a stock screw to hold the case half together on the far opposite from the motor side. After that, we did reattach the stock drive shafts currently. Now, I've got a set of MIPs here that I will probably throw on at some point, but I am tempted to keep those stock drive shafts for a little bit. I just want to see how far I can actually push those things. I've had really good luck with those new HD Wildboard drive shafts, and in general, I really think that that is a pretty solid design. I'm positive that I will be able to eventually twist them and then finally break them, but I do think that they will handle more abuse than most people think. But again, we do have a set of MIPs here to throw on whenever the time comes. I'll probably get those built up and set aside, ready to swap in whenever that drive shaft failure does happen. Beyond that, we did leave the spur gear cover off. As you saw when I very first opened that stock transmission, after only the short amount of time that I ran that truck in the mud and water, it already had stuff inside, and that stock pinion gear already had rust on it. So you can tell that even though that is a cover and things like that, water can still get in there. So I'm going to leave that off. I don't always run a spur gear cover anyway, so leaving it off doesn't give me any heartburn. Another thing is we didn't reinstall that stock 27 turn motor because that motor's not going back in. I've already got the brushless power plant that's going to go in this truck ultimately, so I didn't find any need to actually reinstall that 27 turn motor just for the time being. So once we get to that episode where I'm going over the entire power system and electronics, I'll put that back in, or the final motor back in. But for now, right now, there is no motor that sits inside of this truck. Anyway, guys, I'm pretty excited for this build still. I think everything's going really well, and I'm pretty excited to get this thing finished up. So with that, and for tonight, I'm going to call it. We will see you on the next one.